The rain came down in sheets across Highway 66, turning the desert asphalt into rivers of black glass that reflected the dying light of a storm-choked afternoon. It was the kind of rain that didn't belong in this part of the Southwest, the kind that made the old-timers shake their heads and mutter about changing times. The Vixen sat behind the wheel of her midnight black 1969 Dodge Charger, wipers beating a steady rhythm against the downpour. Her leather jacket, slick with moisture from the brief moment she'd stepped outside at the last gas station 20 miles back. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and her eyes, lined with the precise flick of coal that every woman worth her salt knew how to apply in 1971, scanned the road ahead with the practiced awareness of someone who'd learned long ago that trouble rarely announced itself with fanfare. The highway stretched endlessly before her, a ribbon of possibility and danger, and she drove it like she drove through life, with one hand on the wheel and the other ready for whatever came next. She wasn't running from anything, not anymore. She'd left that version of herself somewhere back in Nebraska, buried under a different name, and a past she'd remade with her own two hands. Now she was just moving, the way tumbleweeds moved, the way clouds moved across this big empty sky, belonging everywhere and nowhere all at once. The chrome details of her Charger caught what little light penetrated the storm clouds, and the deep rumble of the 440 Magnum engine beneath the hood was a constant reminder of the power she commanded. This wasn't just transportation. This was freedom wrapped in steel and leather, independence measured in horsepower and miles. The Vixen had rebuilt parts of this engine herself, her hands stained with grease and her mind focused on the meditation of mechanical precision, back when she'd worked that summer at the garage in Albuquerque. The bad guy had watched her then, leaning against the doorframe with a cigarette burning between his fingers, saying nothing but seeing everything. He understood what the car meant to her, understood it the way only another outlaw could, because his own 1967 Chevrolet Chevelle SS sat outside like a dark green promise of speed and escape. They'd never needed words to communicate the important things. The language they spoke was written in engine codes and highway miles, in the unspoken loyalty that bound people who lived on the edges of acceptable society. Before we go any further down this rain-soaked highway, if you're drawn to stories of dangerous love and vintage rebellion, of leather and chrome and hearts that refuse to be tamed, hit that like button and subscribe to Classic Romance Stories. Drop a comment telling us about your favorite muscle car, and let's build a community of outlaws and dreamers together. Now, let's get back to that stormy afternoon and see what fate had waiting around the next curve. The two girls appeared like apparitions through the curtain of rain, standing on the shoulder of the highway near an overturned Volkswagen Beetle that had clearly hydroplaned and rolled into the shallow ditch. The Vixen's foot moved to the brake instinctively, her mind already calculating angles and outcomes the way it always did when presented with a situation that required decision. The Beetle was baby blue, now streaked with mud and desert sand, one wheel still spinning slowly in the air like a dying insect. The girls couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, wearing the kind of bright, hopeful clothes that marked them as college students or maybe runaways chasing the myth of California freedom. One had blood running down her temple, mixing with rainwater to create pale pink rivulets that disappeared into the collar of her paisley blouse. The other was holding her arm at an odd angle, protective and pained. They looked at the Vixen's approaching Charger with the desperate hope of people who understood they'd used up most of their luck already today. The highway was empty in both directions, a fact that felt both fortunate and ominous in equal measure. Out here, help could be hours away, and the kind of help that did arrive wasn't always the kind you wanted. The Vixen pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under her tires, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was filled immediately by the percussion of rain on metal, on glass, on the thirsty earth that had been waiting months for this kind of downpour. She reached into the glove box past the .38 Special she kept there, finding instead the small first aid kit she'd started carrying after a bad night in Tucson, when the bad guy had taken a bottle across his knuckles in a bar. Fight that hadn't been his fault, but had become his problem anyway. She'd patched him up in a motel bathroom while he'd sat on the edge of the tub, bleeding and silent, his eyes on her face with an intensity that had made her hands shake slightly as she worked. That was when she'd started carrying the kit, not because she was soft, but because she was practical, and because taking care of the people you loved was its own kind of strength. The rain soaked through her jacket the moment she stepped outside. Cold and insistent, but the Vixen had been wet before, had been cold before, had been in worse situations than this, and come out the other side with her head high and her spine straight. She moved toward the girls with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done and wasn't going to waste time with unnecessary questions or empty reassurances. The girl with the head wound spoke first, her voice shaky, but trying hard to maintain composure. They'd been driving to Los Angeles, she explained, trying to make it before nightfall, when the rain had started coming down so hard they couldn't see the road. The Beetle had fishtailed, she'd overcorrected, and then they were spinning, rolling, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of sky and ground and terror. Her friend, the one with the injured arm, just nodded along, her face pale beneath her tan, shock settling in like an unwelcome guest. The Vixen worked efficiently, cleaning the head wound with supplies from her kit and determining it wasn't as bad as it looked, the way head wounds always bled dramatically but often weren't serious. The arm was another matter, possibly broken, definitely sprained, and would need more attention than she could provide on the side of the highway. She helped both girls into the back seat of her Charger, moving with the economical grace of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste motion or energy. The leather seats were already wet from her own soaked clothing, and the interior smelled like rain and motor oil, and the faint ghost of the cigarettes the bad guy smoked when he was thinking hard about something. She cranked the heat, pointing the vents toward the back, and watched in the rearview mirror as color slowly returned to the girls' faces. The nearest town was 15 miles south, a nothing little place called Red Creek that existed mainly as a gas station, a motel, and a bar that served food if you were desperate or drunk enough not to care about quality. The Vixen had been through there before, had stopped for gas and coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in, and had noted the way the locals had looked at her, at her car. At the whole package she presented with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. Small towns out here had long memories and short patience for outsiders, but they also had a rough code of honor that sometimes surprised people. She drove carefully through the rain, the Charger's wipers working overtime, her attention split between the treacherous road and the two girls in her back seat who were starting to talk quietly to each other, processing their survival, their luck, the kindness of the dark-haired stranger in the black muscle car who'd stopped when she could have just kept driving. The Vixen didn't think of herself as kind exactly. Kindness implied softness, and she'd worked too hard to shed that skin. But she thought of herself as fair, as someone who helped when help was needed. Not because it made her good, but because it made her human, and humanity was something worth holding on to even when you lived outside the neat lines society drew for acceptable behavior. Red Creek appeared through the rain like a mirage, its neon signs blurred and haloed by moisture, the motel's vacancy light blinking red against the gray afternoon. The Vixen pulled up to the small clinic that doubled as the town doctor's house, a white clapboard building with a covered porch and a shingle that swung in the wind. Doc Morrison had been practicing medicine out here since the Second World War, and he'd seen enough road accidents, bar fights, and general calamity to remain unflappable in the face of most emergencies. The Vixen helped the girls inside, explained the situation in her low, clear voice that carried authority without aggression, and handed over enough cash to cover whatever treatment they'd need, plus a little extra for discretion. Doc Morrison, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, despite his 70-some years, nodded his understanding and asked no questions beyond the medical necessities. This was another rule of the highway, another code of the outlaw life. You didn't pry into people's business unless they invited you in, and you respected the silences as much as the words. The girls tried to thank her, stumbling over their gratitude and their shock, but the Vixen just shook her head slightly, rain dripping from her hair onto the clinic's worn linoleum floor. She told them to be more careful, to respect the road and the weather and their own mortality. And then she was gone, back out into the rain, back to her Charger, back to the highway that was always waiting. She drove to the motel and paid for a room, not because she was tired, but because the rain. showed no signs of stopping, and even the Vixen knew better than to push her luck too far in conditions like these. The room was what she expected, clean enough, spare enough, with a bed covered in a faded green bedspread and a TV that probably got 3 channels if you held the antenna just right. She stripped off her wet jacket and boots, ran a towel through her hair, and then did something she almost never did. She called the bad guy from the payphone outside, under the motel's overhang, feeding quarters into the slot and listening to the ring echo across whatever distance currently separated them. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice rough with either sleep or whiskey or both, and she told him where she was, what had happened. Nothing more than the facts delivered in her characteristic economy of words. There was silence on the other end, the kind of silence that meant he was processing, calculating, deciding. Then he said he'd be there tomorrow, that he had business to finish tonight, but tomorrow he'd come. And the Vixen smiled slightly because she'd known he would say that, had known it before she'd even picked up the phone. That was the thing about the bad guy. He was exactly what his name suggested, and also somehow more, layers of loyalty and danger and unexpected tenderness that he showed to almost no one except her. The rain continued through the night, a steady drumming on the motel roof that created a cocoon of sound around the Vixen's rented room. She lay on top of the bedspread fully clothed except for her boots, her .38 on the nightstand within easy reach, and thought about the 2 girls she'd helped and about probability and luck and the thin line between disaster and salvation. She thought about the bad guy driving through the night to reach her, even though she hadn't asked him to come, even though she was perfectly capable of handling herself. That was another thing people misunderstood about their relationship. It wasn't about need or dependence, or one of them being weaker than the other. It was about choice. About 2 people who decided that moving through this world together was better than moving through it alone, even though either of them could have managed solo just fine. She'd proven that 100 times, in 100 different situations, and he'd never tried to diminish her strength or put himself above her. They were equals in all the ways that mattered. 2 outlaws who'd found in each other not a missing piece, but a mirror, a reflection of the same fierce independence and unwillingness to be tamed by convention or expectation. Morning came wrapped in clear skies and the peculiar quality of light that follows a desert storm, everything washed clean and sharp-edged. The Vixen stood outside her motel room with a cup of terrible coffee from the lobby, watching the highway and waiting without appearing to wait, her posture relaxed, but her awareness complete. She'd changed into dry clothes, a black tank top and jeans that fit like they'd been made for her, her leather jacket back on despite the warming day, because the jacket was armor and identity and style all wrapped into one. She saw the red Mustang while it was still a quarter mile away, recognized the particular shade of candy apple red that could only mean a 1969 Mustang Boss 429, one of the rarest and most powerful muscle cars ever to roll out of Detroit's factories. The bad guy had been looking for a Boss 429 for 2 years, had turned down lesser Mustangs and inferior deals, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that some things were worth the wait. Apparently he'd found it, and apparently he'd found it at exactly the right moment to come to her. The Mustang's engine note was distinctive, the 429 cubic inch semi-Hemi V8 producing a sound that was less a rumble and more a roar, announcing its arrival with the confidence of something that had never needed to ask permission to exist. He pulled into the motel parking lot and killed the engine, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the distance of 20 feet and 1,000 unspoken understandings. The bad guy stepped out of the Mustang wearing jeans, boots, and a leather jacket similar to hers, but more worn, more weathered by miles and experience. His dark hair was longer than convention dictated, and his face carried the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from living hard and not apologizing for it. He had a day's worth of stubble and eyes that missed nothing, that cataloged everything about her appearance and demeanor in a single sweep, assessing not because he doubted her, but because that's what people like them did, constantly reading situations and people for threats and opportunities. The Vixen set down her coffee cup on the railing and moved toward him, not hurrying, but not hesitating either. And when they came together, it was with the kind of kiss that erased the distance they'd been apart and confirmed the connection they shared. His hands found her waist, her fingers traced the line of his jaw, and neither of them cared that they were standing in full view of the highway and the motel office and anyone who might be watching. Let them watch. Let them see what it looked like when two people chose each other completely. When they finally broke apart, the bad guy tilted his head toward the Mustang, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. She walked around the car slowly, appreciating the lines and the chrome and the raw power contained beneath that sleek red exterior. The Boss 429 was a legend for good reason, built for NASCAR homologation requirements, but quickly becoming the darling of street racers and collectors who understood what they were looking at. This particular specimen was pristine, or as pristine as a 3-year-old car could be after being driven hard and lived in, which was exactly how it should be. These machines weren't meant to sit in garages under covers, weren't meant to be museum pieces divorced from their purpose. They were meant to move, to eat up miles of highway, to be the physical manifestation of freedom and rebellion and the refusal to accept limits. The Vixen ran her hand along the hood, feeling the residual warmth from the engine, and nodded her approval. The bad guy leaned against the driver's door, watching her with the same intensity he'd shown that day in the Albuquerque garage. And she knew he'd bought this car thinking of her as much as thinking of himself, knowing she'd appreciate it in ways most people couldn't. They went inside her motel room, and he listened while she told him the full story of the previous day. The rain and the girls and the overturned Beetle and the decision to stop and help. He didn't interrupt, didn't question her choices, just took in the information the way he took in everything, processing it through whatever internal calculation he used to make sense of the world. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then told her she'd done the right thing. And coming from him, those words meant something because the bad guy wasn't in the habit of offering empty praise or saying things he didn't mean. He told her about the deal he'd closed the night before, the one that had put the Mustang in his possession, and about the man he'd had to intimidate slightly to make sure the price stayed fair and the title came through clean. The Vixen smiled at that, at the idea of the bad guy using his reputation and his presence to negotiate. And she felt that familiar flutter of attraction mixed with respect that had been there from the beginning and had never diminished. People who didn't understand them thought their relationship was toxic or dangerous. But those people lived in a different world with different rules, and their opinions didn't penetrate the bubble of understanding that existed between two people who truly saw each other clearly. They left Red Creek in convoy, the Vixen in her black Charger and the bad guy in his red Mustang, two muscle cars moving down Highway 66 like bullets fired from the same gun. The highway stretched ahead of them endlessly, heat waves already beginning to shimmer off the asphalt despite the previous day's rain. They drove fast, but not recklessly, staying within sight of each other, occasionally pulling alongside on the empty stretches where the double yellow line was more suggestion than law. The desert landscape rolled past in shades of brown and red, and the occasional shock of green where water collected in hidden places. They passed abandoned gas stations with rusted pumps standing like sentinels over forgotten dreams of prosperity. They passed roadside attractions that had seen better days, their paint fading and their parking lots empty. They passed other travelers, but not many, because this was still the lonely part of America. The part where you could drive for an hour without seeing another soul, where the land was bigger than the people who tried to live on it. At a crossroads town called Junction, where 3 highways met in a confusion of signs and possibilities. They stopped at a chrome-fronted diner that looked like it had been transplanted directly from 1957 and never bothered to update. The Vixen slid into a red vinyl booth across from the bad guy, and they ordered coffee and pie from a waitress who'd seen enough of life to recognize kindred spirits. In the 2 leather-clad strangers who carried themselves like they owned the world or at least didn't care who did. The jukebox in the corner played songs about heartbreak and highways, about leaving and returning, about all the themes that had dominated American music since the first person realized that 3 chords and the truth could capture something essential about the human experience. The bad guy reached across the table and took the Vixen's hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm, a gesture of affection and possession and partnership, all wrapped into one simple touch. She met his eyes and saw reflected there the same fire she felt burning in her own chest, the same unwillingness to live a small, safe, predictable life when large, dangerous, unpredictable ones were available for the taking. They talked about where to go next, about a job the bad guy had heard about in Arizona that might be worth looking into, about the Vixen's desire to head west toward the coast and the ocean she hadn't seen in 3 years. They talked about the girls from yesterday and whether they'd made it to Los Angeles and whether California would give them whatever it was they were looking for. They talked about the Mustang and the Charger and which one would win in a straight race, though they both knew the Vixen's 440 Magnum would probably take it in terms of pure power, even if the Boss 429 had its own considerable strengths. They talked the way long-term partners talk, comfortable silences mixed with bursts of conversation. No need to fill every moment with noise, because their connection existed in the spaces between words as much as in the words themselves. The waitress refilled their coffee without asking, and the pie was better than it had any right to be, and the afternoon sun slanted through the diner's windows, turning everything golden and possible. This was the life they'd chosen. This rolling collection of moments, strung together by highway miles and shared glances, and the understanding that they were stronger together than apart, even though neither of them was weak alone. When they finally pushed back from the booth and dropped bills on the table that included a generous tip for the waitress who'd left them alone, the world outside the diner looked different somehow, sharper and more vibrant. The Mustang and the Charger sat side by side in the parking lot like horses that had been ridden hard and were ready to run again. The bad guy caught the Vixen around the waist before she could reach her car, pulled her against him with the confidence of someone who knew his touch was welcome, and kissed her with the kind of intensity that made everything else fall away. She kissed him back with equal fire, her hands fisted in his jacket, her body pressed against his, and when they broke apart, they were both breathing harder. This was their truth, messy and passionate and absolutely genuine. Two people who'd found something rare and weren't willing to let convention or judgment or anything else diminish it. The bad guy traced her bottom lip with his thumb, a gesture so tender it seemed to contradict everything the world assumed about people like them. But the Vixen knew better. Tenderness and toughness weren't opposites. They were two sides of the same coin, and the strongest people she'd ever known were the ones who could be both. They decided to head west together, toward California and the coast, and whatever adventures or troubles waited there. The bad guy would follow the Vixen, or she would follow him, taking turns leading, sometimes racing, sometimes cruising, the arrangement fluid and equal like everything between them. They would stop when they wanted to stop, drive when they wanted to drive, answer to no one except each other, and even then, only in the ways they chose. The highway called to them like it always called, promising nothing except miles and possibility and the freedom to be exactly who they were without apology or explanation. As they prepared to leave Junction, the Vixen looked at the bad guy across the space between their cars and felt that familiar surge of emotion that was part love, part respect, part recognition of a fellow traveler on this strange journey through life. He nodded at her, a small acknowledgement of everything they shared, everything they were, everything they'd built together out of chrome and leather and pure, stubborn will to live on their own terms. The engines roared to life simultaneously, the Charger's 440 and the Mustang's 429 creating a symphony of American engineering and outlaw spirit. The Vixen pulled on her sunglasses, checked her mirrors, and felt the familiar thrill that came with pointing a powerful car down an open highway with nowhere she had to be and everywhere she wanted to go. The bad guy was right there beside her, visible in her peripheral vision, his red Mustang a perfect complement to her black Charger. And together they were a statement, a declaration, a middle finger to everyone who thought life had to be lived small and safe and predictable. They accelerated out of Junction in perfect synchronization. Two muscle cars carrying two outlaws deeper into the American West, into the mythology they were creating with every mile, every choice. Every moment they chose each other and freedom over security and conformity. The road stretched ahead of them endlessly, and they took it the way they took everything, with eyes wide open and hearts that refused to be tamed, two parts of a whole that was greater than the sum of its pieces. The desert gave way to foothills, and the foothills began to hint at mountains beyond, and still they drove, eating up the miles with the hunger of people who understood that the journey was the destination, that the movement itself was the point. They passed through towns with names like Promise and Redemption and Hope, and the irony wasn't lost on either of them, that their kind of love, their kind of life, existed in the spaces between such places, in the in-between zones where rules grew fuzzy and possibilities expanded. The afternoon aged into evening, the sky turning colors that seemed impossible, oranges and purples and reds so vivid they looked painted on. The Vixen felt the weight of yesterday's rescue lifting, felt herself returning fully to the present moment, to the simple, perfect reality of driving fast with the bad guy beside her, and the whole world spread out before them like a map with no borders drawn. They stopped for the night at a motel outside Bakersfield. 2 rooms this time because they liked having the option, even though they'd both probably end up in one. Sprawled across a bed, too small for 2 people, unless those people didn't mind being tangled together. The parking lot was gravel, and the neon sign buzzed with electrical fatigue, and the whole place had the worn, honest quality of something that had been used hard but was still standing. The Vixen and the bad guy stood in the space between their cars, neither ready to go inside yet, both wanting to extend this moment, this day, this perfect stretch of time when everything had aligned the way it was supposed to. The night air was cool and clean, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle blew, that lonesome sound that had been the soundtrack to American wandering since long before muscle cars ruled the highways. The bad guy told the Vixen she looked beautiful in the neon light, which was the kind of thing he said rarely enough that it always landed with impact when he did. She smiled, a real smile that showed teeth and reached her eyes, and told him his Mustang suited him, which was her way of returning the compliment because they spoke in metaphors and understood the translation. They went inside eventually to one room as predicted, and they made love with the rough tenderness that characterized everything between them. 2 equals claiming and being claimed, 2 bodies speaking the truth that words sometimes couldn't quite capture. Afterward, they lay in the darkness with the neon from outside painting patterns on the ceiling. And the Vixen thought about the girls from yesterday and hoped they were okay, hoped they'd learned something from their brush with disaster, hoped they understood how lucky they'd been, that the right person had come along at the right moment. The bad guy's breathing evened out into sleep, his arm heavy across the Vixen's waist, his presence a comfort and a constant. The Vixen stayed awake a little longer, her mind running through the events of the past day, filing them away into the collection of memories that made up her life. She thought about choice and consequence, about the rain that had brought her to Red Creek and the sunshine that had brought the bad guy to her. She thought about the red Mustang sitting outside next to her black Charger, 2 beautiful machines representing 2 beautiful lives that had intersected and intertwined without either losing their individual identity. She thought about tomorrow and the day after and all the days beyond that, stretching out like the highway stretching out, unknown and full of potential. Finally, she closed her eyes and let sleep take her, content in the knowledge that wherever the road led next, she wouldn't be traveling it alone, but also wouldn't be diminished by the company. That was the magic of what she and the bad guy had built together. A partnership that enhanced rather than limited, that freed rather than trapped, that understood love as something wild and dangerous and absolutely worth the risk of everything.